about absorption costing versus variable costing. Absorption costing is what we've been learning all along. All overhead, whether it's fixed or variable, gets absorbed into the units that we make and hangs out in finished goods until it's sold. The problem is that can lead to two misleading facts. First of all, fixed overhead can hide out there in finished goods, and secondly, if we make more units than we need, that means those extra units are absorbing costs that otherwise would have been allocated to the units that we sold, so it looks like we made more money when all we did was make more units. So please remember that our income statement in absorption costing is sales minus cost of goods sold gives us gross profit, minus selling general and administrative expenses gives us our operating income. So while dollars are hanging out in our inventory that we're going to work on, our inventory that we're working on, and the inventory that we're finished working on, those dollars do not appear as expenses on our income statement. They only appear as an expense when we sell the goods. Sales minus cost of goods sold gives us gross profit, minus selling general and administrative expenses gives us our operating income. So let's see if we can find the problem, the shortcoming of absorption costing without using any numbers. So remember, we take our materials, our labor, and our overhead, and we move them into work in process. In this example, I've used green font for the materials, blue font for the labor, and black font for the overhead. Notice how we made no distinction between fixed overhead and variable overhead. Once the stuff is in work in process, we work on it and we finish it. So now all that overhead, again, whether it was variable or fixed, hangs out here in finished goods and doesn't hit the income statement until we sell the goods. What if instead we broke our manufacturing overhead into two categories, variable and fixed? Suppose we make kayaks. What about the lacquer we put on the kayaks? That's a variable overhead cost. It's a material, but it's too small for us to track, too difficult for us to track, so we'll take that and we'll move it into overhead, and we'll apply it using our overhead application rate. And then we also have fixed overhead, like the rent on the factory. So if we don't make any kayaks at all, there'll be no variable overhead, but we will still spend money on the factory rent, and that's the whole point. Fixed overhead we're going to spend whether we make 0 units or 10 million units. So maybe we ought to subtract that. So what we're going to do is we're going to take variable overhead and move that into work in process, from work in process into finished goods along with our raw materials and our labor, and eventually into cost of goods sold. But fixed overhead we're going to treat like a period cost. And fixed overhead is going to get subtracted in the period that we incurred. It's not going to hang out up here and hence hide out in finished goods or absorb costs that might otherwise have gone to the units that we sold. Okay, let's do one with numbers now. Suppose we had beginning finished goods inventory of 0. We expect to sell 20,000 units at $15 a unit. In other words, sales will be 300,000. Our direct materials and our factory labor, our direct labor, are $6 per unit. So whether we make 1 unit or 10,000 units, it's, let's say, $3 worth of labor and $3 worth of materials. Doesn't matter how that breaks down. Those are our variable manufacturing costs. And let's say we have only fixed manufacturing overhead, and it's $60,000. Remember, we plan on selling 20,000 units. If we make those 20,000 units only, and we divide that fixed manufacturing overhead evenly among those 20,000 units, each unit is going to absorb $3 worth of fixed overhead. However, if we make extra units, we make an extra 10,000 units, now we're making a total of 30,000 units. Since we're making 30,000 units and there's $60,000 worth of overhead, each unit is going to absorb $2 worth of overhead. So if we make 20,000 units, our cost per unit is going to be $3 of overhead plus $6 of materials and labor. If we make 30,000 units, our cost per unit is going to be $8, which represents $6 of manufacturing costs, materials and labor, and only $2 of overhead. And finally, the SG&A, there's a variable part of $1 per unit and fixed selling and administrative expenses of $15,000. The only difference between absorption costing and variable costing is the treatment of fixed overhead. SG&A is the same, variable costs are the same. The only difference is fixed overhead. In absorption costing, that fixed overhead is absorbed by all the units produced. And in variable costing, that fixed overhead is subtracted right away. It doesn't get to hang out, doesn't get to hide out in finished goods inventory. It gets subtracted right away to see how much money we made. All right, here come the numbers. Let's do absorption first. That's one we've always looked at before. Sales minus cost of goods sold gives us gross profit, minus selling, general, and administrative expenses gives us our net income. If we make 20,000 units and sell 20,000 units, our sales are $300,000. Our cost of goods sold is those $20,000 units times $9 a unit. Remember, there was $6 of variable materials and labor plus $3 for fixed overhead. Then we subtract our variable SG&A and our fixed SG&A, and we have net income of $85,000. If we produce 30,000 units, what's going to happen is our cost of goods sold is going to look smaller because those units that we don't sell are absorbing that extra fixed overhead. So now let's make 30,000 units. Our sales are still the same. We're still only selling 20,000, but our cost of goods sold goes down because each unit only costs us $8. Because remember, each unit absorbed only $2 of fixed overhead instead of $3 of fixed overhead. So our gross profit looks $20,000 better, and our net income looks $20,000 better. So it looks like we made more money when all we did was make more units. So a manager might say, hey, I'll make more units, I'll look more profitable, I'll hit my bonus. But what's happening is you have 10,000 units building up in inventory. How much inventory should a company have? Just enough. Too much inventory is eating up interest costs, storage costs, insurance costs, handling costs. So maybe a better way to look at things for management's point of view, because we can't use variable costing on our financials, but we can use it for internal reports, is to use this variable costing. So remember, sales minus variable cost gives us contribution margin, minus fixed costs gives us net income. And so our fixed overhead is going to go right to the bottom line, if you will. It'll get subtracted and not hide out with the units in finished goods inventory. So our sales are still the same. Our variable cost of goods sold is $120,000. In other words, that's the $6 per unit of materials and labor. Our variable SG&A is at $20,000. That's the 20,000 times $1, and that gives us contribution margin of $160,000. Our fixed overhead is $60,000, so we subtract it right away. Our fixed SG&A is $15,000, and so we have net income of $85,000. So if our production equals our sales, the net income under the absorption method is the same as the income under the variable method. So now let's use variable costing. Again, we can't use this in our financial statements, but we can use it for internal purposes to price out what's happened to us. We make 30,000 units, but we sell 20,000, so our sales are still 300,000. Our variable cost of goods sold is still the 120,000 because each unit still costs us $6 in variable cost. That's $6 of labor and materials. In this example, there's no variable overhead. We subtract the variable selling and general and administrative expenses, so that gives us our contribution margin of 160. That's the same, minus the fixed overhead of 60,000, minus the $15,000 of fixed SG&A, and we're at 85,000, which makes sense. If we sold 20,000 units, we should have the same net income. We shouldn't reward ourselves because some inventory is hiding our fixed overhead costs for us. And so what's going to happen is that if the production and the sales are the same, then the net income under both methods is the same. If, however, production exceeds sales, costs are hiding out, so the absorption method is going to look better. If production is less than sales, that means that old costs that were hiding out with old units are coming out, and then our variable is going to look better. So big picture, the problem with absorption costing is it treats all overhead the same, and maybe we ought to think about overhead in terms of variable versus fixed, and maybe we ought to move the variable into work in process, that's just fine. But let's treat the fixed overhead as if it were a period cost. Let's subtract it, because you know what? We've got to pay rent on that factory, whether we make 1 kayak, 2 kayaks, or 1,000,000 kayaks. So we ought to subtract that right away. So as I say, you can't use variable costing on your financial statements, but you can certainly use it on internal reports to help management make better decisions. Hope that helps.